Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about our history because our history is under attack. And this is a problem, and it's something that's going to take a lot of work to solve if it's ever solved. You know, years ago, no matter what country you lived in, you respected the history, you learned the history. And the old saying was that we learn from our history. And that's very important because we do learn from our history. And that is true in every aspect of everything that we deal with when it comes to history. It's a teaching tool. It's a thing to expand our minds. Now, I have spoken on this before in different aspects of it, but I wanted to talk about the very core of this because it is a major problem that is not going to resolve itself for a very, very long time, if ever. Now, in the United States, we do have somewhat of a checkered history, and I will be the first to admit that. Just like Germany has had a checkered history. But I will tell you, there should be lots of information about the Third Reich. There should be lots of information about the Nazi era in Germany because people need to know about it. See, the way you learn and the way to keep you from ever doing something so stupid again is to make sure it is well known. In the United States, we had a civil war. We had Indian campaigns. We had Jim Crow. We had slavery. Every country had slavery. We had to have a war to end it, which is kind of frightening. I believe there are only two countries that had to have a war to end slavery. I believe one was Haiti and the other is the United States. But nonetheless, the Confederate statues that are all over the place, maybe too many of them, but still, they're important pieces of history. And we can never, ever destroy them because we need to learn from them. Slavery was an ugly period of our time, and there's lots of people that were involved. Let's just not forget the fact that Alexander Hamilton was involved in the slave trade. That becomes kind of an ugly situation when we have this whole big musical coming out, Hamilton. No one wants to talk about the fact that he was involved in the slave trade. Washington, of course, had lots of slaves. Benjamin Franklin had a few slaves. The Adamses did not, but a vast majority of the wealthy had slaves. The common man did not. You know, it's an interesting thing. If you went down the ranks of Civil War soldiers from the South, I would be willing to say that probably about 90% of them did not have slaves because they couldn't afford it. That was a very expensive commodity. In fact, it was one of the most highest commodities in the South at the time. But the thing is, we need to always know about that history. It always has to be staring us in the face. We need to be reminded of our fine works and our bad works, and the great mistakes that we made and the terrible errors that were made. You always need to broadcast that. Now, it has slowed down a little bit, but there was this rampant craziness over statues for a while. But it's not gone. It's just in a hiatus for a little while. I mean, statues of Theodore Roosevelt are being attacked in New York City. We're still dealing with Columbus. You know, these are but statues. You know, I would love to see statues of great African American leaders all over. I think that's important. I think there should be more of them. But I think a lot of the statues that are standing now should stay. Not a plethora of them, I think there's 800 Civil War statues that deal with the Confederacy, and that's a bit much. 400 is fine. But, we need to have statues of other people. But we don't want to destroy our history. Because once you destroy our history, then we lose something that can never, ever be replaced. And that's important because something, you have to understand that today, how many people really know their history? How many people really know the history of the American Civil War? How many people really understand the slave trade as it was? And the awful nature of Jim Crow. This was terrible. The KKK. They were terrible things that happened. There are no monuments to the KKK, and that's fine with me. Leave it that way. But there should be statues dealing with the Confederacy because it wasn't all about slavery. I know we make it into that, but you have to understand that slaves were in the border states. Slaves were in the northern states. You have to remember one of the hotbeds for the illegal slave trade was New York City. New York City on the East River is where the ships used to come in the black market with slaves. It was an illegal thing to bring slaves into the United States, but New York City was pro-South. New Jersey was pro-South. To a degree, parts of Connecticut were pro-South. That was where all the industry was. And therefore, they were very, very keen on keeping close contacts with the South. That history isn't talked about much, and I think it should. I think we should know everything about our history, and I think we should constantly make ourselves aware of it. Because once you remove things, once you take things out of our eyesight, you won't think of it. And we need to think of it. We need to remind ourselves of things. Now, granted, there are things that we really don't need. There are things that maybe bother people, that insult people. Perhaps the flags. I know there's so many different things with the flags. The real Confederate flag didn't look like the one that everyone's complained about. I believe that's a battle flag for the Army of Virginia. That's the only one that seems to get used, but the original Confederate flag looked a little different. The American flag looked different over time. I mean, there's all of this history needs to be remembered. We need to remember the awful nature of what we did to Mexico. We need to know the awful nature of what we did to the American Indian. And we should have markers and monuments to Native Americans. The Indians suffered terribly under a genocide. Perhaps the worst Holocaust that ever existed was put forth by the United States against the American Indian. So there's an awful lot of history that is bad, but we need to always remember it. Once again, if you remove it, we forget it. And you have to remember, we have a lot of people right now fighting against our history and wishing to remove it. And in many cases, that has to deal with an ignorance factor rather than an intellect factor. Once again, you have to remember, we have a strong body of ignorance going on right now. People don't know their history. People don't understand their country. People don't understand the laws. People don't understand much of what makes the country work. And they want to tear things down without using any sense of why things exist in the first place. So, my feeling is history is under attack, and history is going to take quite a beating. And it is our job, those of us who love history, to make sure it is not forgotten, to make sure it's shared, to make sure it's experienced, whether it's good or it's bad. That's the important thing about history, and that is the important job that is the purpose of every person who loves history, understands history, and wishes to promote it and share it with new and upcoming generations.